We all know farming has changed. With new and ever-advancing technologies, American farming and ranching doesn't look like it used to. Across the country, in operations big and small, we're making choices that help keep agriculture sustainable for your grandchildren and ours. Our values are the same. We grow crops and raise livestock and poultry so you can raise families that are happy and healthy. And thanks to innovations in agriculture, we're feeding more people with fewer resources. With innovation come questions, and we're here with answers. So let's talk. From basic terminology so you can speak the same language and ask the right questions, to complex topics like environmental impact and GMOs. Food dialogues exist to provide answers to your questions about food, straight from the people who produce it. So get to know who we are, how we work, and why we love what we do.
Thank you for joining us for our Agri-Pulse Washington Week in Review. I'm Spencer Chase, joined as always by Agri-Pulse Senior Editor Phil Brasher, discussing the week that was, agriculturally speaking, in Washington, D.C. And suffice it to say, it was a busy week here in Washington, and it was a prelude of other busy and potentially busier weeks to come. And that is because, as we have been discussing on this program and in other coverage venues of agripulse.com, that there's a farm bill coming. And so at this point, here's what we know. We know that the House Farm Bill is expected to be on the floor next week. We know that amendments on that Farm Bill have been filed. What we don't know, Phil, is which of those amendments are going to be made in order and will actually receive consideration on the House floor.
And that's a huge, huge issue. The chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, Mike Conaway, he's got two big tasks right now. He's got to line up the votes to pass the bill, ultimately. He's heading in the weekend, doesn't have all the votes that he needs. He says there's a lot of members who are still saying they're uncommitted, so he's got to line up the bills, he's got to line up the votes to ultimately pass the bill. But the other big issue are the amendments, and because there are a number that are filed that attack various parts of crop insurance, a harvest price option. There's a means testing amendment for premium subsidies. There's an amendment that would lower the rate of return, seeks to lower the rate of return for insurance companies, and there are others as well. There is a sugar amendment that is potentially a big challenge for Conaway in terms of protecting the sugar program. So, one, he's got to limit the number of amendments, working with the leadership, working with the Rules Committee, to those that he thinks he can beat, but still allows debate on the issues. At the same time, he's got to have the votes to defeat these really critical amendments, and I would put sugar in that category and crop insurance as being probably the two highest priorities in terms of programs that Conaway really needs to protect going into the floor debate presumably next week, unless something falls apart. Yeah, big task, and two big tasks that the chairman and the House leadership has going into this debate.
And so you mentioned House leadership and Senate leadership trekked to the White House this week to discuss the Farm Bill and with President Trump, who there were reports emerging prior to that meeting that he was going to use that meeting to issue a veto threat. But it sounds like the way things are looking, they left that meeting without the veto threat, but President Trump did get a request from House Ag Committee Chairman Mike Conaway to use his famous, some would say infamous, Twitter account to help promote the bill and the work requirements therein.
Yeah, well, I would keep an eye on Real Donald Trump Twitter account.
If you didn't already.
If you didn't already. I happen to get notifications on my phone because you never know what the president is going to say and what's going to be the story of the day because he said it on Twitter. But there's a good chance that the president will put out a tweet or two on the Farm Bill. This could help with those uncommitted conservatives that we talked about in the House. be very interesting, by the way, if he were actually to take a position in crop insurance or sugar, but we'll have to see. I'm sure Chairman Conaway would really like that. But that could help, actually could help some with House conservatives to give them a little nudge to ultimately vote for the bill. And if they listen to Conaway, they listen to House Speaker Paul Ryan, vote against these bills, these amendments that the committee and Chairman Conaway consider poison pills that could bring the whole bill down, and certainly sugar amendment would be in that category, and crop insurance as well.
But as helpful as those tweets and the leadership push that we're seeing from House Speaker Paul Ryan, his office, and some members of his office have been promoting the work requirements of the bill on Twitter this week. As helpful as that could be on the House side, it could be equally detrimental, one would think, to getting Senate Democrats, which will be needed to pass a farm bill with 60 votes in the Senate, could be detrimental in that push.
Yeah, and that's where this veto, possibility of a veto could come in what position the president ultimately takes. Because the Republican strategy right now is to get this farm bill through the House with tougher work requirements for food stamp recipients, SNAP recipients, and then send it over the Senate, knowing that full well that the Senate Agriculture Committee is going to toss these aside, most likely, because otherwise you can't get a bill out of the Senate, because it needs at least 60 votes. And the leaders of the committee have actually talked about getting as many as 70 votes. That may be quite a reach, but it's possible. But the real question comes: do they have amendments on the floor in the Senate? Because there's many Republicans who would like to put some of those vulnerable Senate Democrats, like Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, John Tester from Montana, Joe Donnelly from Indiana. They would really like to put them on the hot seat, force them to vote on the issue of work requirements, because Republicans believe this is really a popular issue in many states, and especially rural areas, and with the public in general. And I know there's some rural House Democrats who think it's a tough issue potentially for them. It's a tough issue to debate, really. They have their reasons for opposing them, but it's not something that you can say in a 30-second or 15-second soundbite. So a lot of politics to come, tricky politics between the House and the Senate. And again, ultimately, can you get a bill to the president? Does it have to have work requirements? Does it not have to have work requirements? We still don't know, because the president did not actually wind up drawing a line.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of tricky politics, biofuels. That's been a subject that has really been holding the nation's agricultural attention here for the last couple of months, as a series of White House meetings on the subject has unfolded. And we had what we anticipate to be the last White House meeting on the subject this week. That's based on sourcing that we have that says the White House thinks this is the last meeting on the subject. They think they're over and done with. But there are still some things up in the air left to be determined. Basically, they left with the agreement that the Reed vapor pressure waiver that the biofuels groups have sought to allow themselves to sell E15 during the summer months, that waiver will be pushed for by the administration. The administration also will not pursue a cap on the price of renewable identification numbers that measure RFS compliance. However, there was discussion that came out of this meeting about the potential for using gallons that have been waived through small refinery exemptions here, and those reports have been swirling in the last couple of weeks. Potentially over 1 billion gallons of ethanol demand has been waived through these exemptions, using those waived gallons to fulfill export requirements that could potentially be instated by the administration through an export RIN. And the biofuels community not excited about that at all. I had one source text me and say that it could potentially be worse than a RIN cap. And so a lot of opinions swirling on the biofuels issue right now, but there's kind of this mixed feeling between this potential optimism about getting the Reed vapor pressure waiver, but at the same time this concern about what that export RIN could do to the industry. And really at this point there were a few people in the room, and they all kind of walked out with different stories on what was the finality of the decision. in that meeting. And
yeah,
so,
well, were there like 10 people in the room? Now we have 10 different.
we somehow ended up with 12 different stories from 10 different people, I think. We've got some coverage up on Agri-Pulse.com. We believe we fleshed out what is the finality of this, looking at comparing all the different stories and seeing where the overlapping Venn diagrams lie.
And I think it's important for our viewers to know too that no matter what gets done, either on the vapor pressure waiver or on the RINs issues, this could be tied up in court.
Right.
I mean, because every other issue,
right,
every other decision EPA has made regarding the RFS has been challenged by one side or the other, right?
Yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah, absolutely. And anything that they do administratively could, in theory, be challenged in a court case. There's been efforts to do things like the Reed vapor pressure waiver via legislation, but that legislation has stalled on Capitol Hill. There's, whether or not they would be able to take up something on the small refinery exemption looks like it would be an uphill battle. Senator John Brasher, who chairs the Environment and Public Works Committee, came out this week with some has come out this week and in previous weeks with some strong language in favor of those exemptions, saying that he supports them and he would need to see any kind of conclusion or any kind of compromise. He would need to see those exemptions remain supported through. And so their route on Capitol Hill looks to be a challenging one.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that EPA has to put something out that they believe that they can defend in court. Now, they may be able to go a few different ways, but they do have to be able to defend it in court, and that's something that tied up the Obama administration for the Obama EPA for a long time with handling the RVOs and the waiver. The waivers on that, not the refinery waivers, but the waivers of the RVO, annual RVOs. So it's a very tricky issue.
And speaking of annual RVOs, those could be published technically any day now, at any point in the next couple weeks, next couple months, so long as the EPA gives themselves enough time to finalize it by November 30th. I believe last week it was over the July 4th week that they published the RVO, but we're hearing it might be a little bit earlier this week. So another thing to watch.
And keeping Spencer tied up.
I mean, I love to just frantically check my email, wondering when the EPA is going to make news on me. But between the Farm Bill debate, between the ongoing negotiations to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement, now is a very good time to be following Agri-Pulse.com. Now is a very good time to consider getting that free trial if you've been on the fence about it, because the next 4 weeks is going to involve a ton of ag policy news. And so I'd encourage you to keep an eye on Agri-Pulse, keep an eye on the work that we're doing and all of our various social media channels, just to stay up to date, up to the minute in terms of what's going on here on Washington and how it's going to affect you back home on your operation. But I'm sure there's something we missed that happened this week, but I think that's going to do it for.
Well, just wait till next week.
Yeah. If Phil and I both have bags under our eyes next week, we apologize in advance, but
we could have some late days.
Yeah, it's going to be some late days next week, but I think that's going to do it for this week. So for Phil Brasher, I'm Spencer Chase. Have a good one.